Find the answers to questions you may or may not have asked yourself here at Kaleidoscience, Conversations on Cognitive Science, hosted by Elisa Palmer and Sönke Löw. Telling a story for me always has a creative component. I recall things I've heard before and combine them to other bits of information. When I'm telling a story to other people or when I'm trying to make a point, I always focus on the feedback they give me. For example, if they nod or shake their heads or how their facial expression looks like. But does that also work in algorithms and computers, or how do they know how to proceed in a story or in a tale? Today we are going to talk with Philipp Wicke. He is an assistant professor at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, but has also done parts of his studies in Osnabrück. So it's going to be a bit exciting for me as well to hear how he came to where he is now. And he's researching on topics related to AI and computational linguistics. Welcome, Philipp.
Welcome. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
And now we come to our usual get-to-know game. And for that, I will begin a sentence and I would like you to spontaneously continue with them. And the first sentence would be, as a kid, I always wanted to be.
A grown-up.
Really? Why did you want to be a grown-up?
I think I was very impatient. I wanted to always get to the next step. So I don't think there was any specific profession, but to have a profession would be nice. And you need to be a grown-up, I guess. Yeah.
Interesting.
The next question is, if I was an emoji, I would be.
The brain emoji, of course.
Ah.
Why, of course?
I think it's the closest to my personality, right? So I study the brain, I use the brain. It's just overall very interesting as a concept, the brain, to understand it, to model it, and all the other emojis, I can't take them too seriously. So, yeah.
So the brain is the actual, real, serious emoji there is, for you at least.
Yeah. So I would say the brain emoji is the only emoji I would use in a scientific context without cringe.
The third question is, my favorite thing to do on a day off is?
Being in nature. I think that's straightforward. Because if I don't have a day off, it's fine. I work close to a really nice garden, a really nice public park. But let's be honest, I don't go there too often while at work. So yeah, whenever I get the chance to not be in an office or be in front of the computer, I try to go out in nature.
Right now, I'm most fascinated by
language. Everything language.
Language. Luckily, we're going to talk about that today, I guess.
Yeah, I hope so.
And the final question is, I know it's time to call it a day when?
When I start fixing a bug and I create more bugs with fixing it, then I know, okay, I've reached the point in which I should just stop and return another day.
Yeah, I guess that's a good sign. And now we come to your scientific background. And as maybe the listeners already noticed, this is the first recording where we are not in a studio, but we are doing this online. So this already tells us that you are not a student at our university or a professor at a university. Lisa already mentioned that, but maybe could you shortly tell us how you got to where you are right now?
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have to think how far back in time I want to go.
Just start when you were born and tell your whole life story.
In the beginning, there was the universe. But I started, actually, I think the first connection was Schnupperstudium in Osnabrück at the cognitive science bachelor's degree. And I mean, inevitably that led to my decision to study cognitive science in Osnabrück.
Maybe for our non-German speaking listeners, Schnupperstudie means tryout studies, where we invite students who are not yet studying to join other fellow cognitive science students, or maybe fellow cognitive science students, to be with them for a couple of days and with the lectures and just get to know how studying is. And we kind of catch quite a lot of people doing that.
Yeah. Thanks for the addition. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I really didn't know what to study. I wanted to study something as broad as possible, and cognitive science, I think, is as broad as it gets. Yeah, and then I did my bachelor's, and in my bachelor's, I did 2 internships. So I looked into 2 different fields. One was neuroinformatics or neuroscience. I did an internship in Singapore. And so that was like a really neuroscience-y internship. And then I did another one in Dublin, in Ireland, in computational linguistics or language creativity. And then after my bachelor's, the supervisor in Ireland said he had a PhD position if I wanted to join. And I did not do so immediately. I took another year of my bachelor's in Osnabrück to just like study whatever I wanted and do fun courses, because there are always really nice courses there. And then after that year, I decided to start the PhD in Ireland. So I went to Dublin and did this for 4 years. And then after those 4 years, it was like the last months, I guess, of the pandemic. I applied for a bunch of different postdoc positions, and I initially applied at the TU Darmstadt, and they forwarded me and said that there is a much better position in Munich. In hindsight, I think that was true. And so that's how I ended up here doing a postdoc at the LMU in a much more language focused field.
At the university in Darmstadt, was it for the cognitive science program when it started there, or was it a linguistics program?
Good question. Yeah, it's actually, they have an NLP department, Ubiquitous Knowledge Processing Lab. And I applied there for a postdoc on AI ethics and language ethics and privacy. And they couldn't really give me the position, so they forwarded me. And then in Munich, the position was also language related. So that's why I got here.
I remember you telling me when we met that you didn't really want to go into the direction of language when you started your bachelor's. So how did it happen that you started an internship, and what fascinated you in language?
Yeah, that's a really good one. As you point out, in my undergrad, we were supposed to study all the different fields, and we had to pick, I think it's 5 out of 8 to specialize or something like this.
It's 9 by now, but it used to be 8 exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And the only 2 or 3 that I didn't specialize are those that I do now mostly, which is maths, linguistics, and computational linguistics. And back then, I have to say, it was mostly that all the other stuff was so interesting. And I think back in the day when I studied computational linguistics, there was a lot of symbolic linguistics. There was a lot of parse trees and stuff like this. It wasn't as exciting as machine learning or something like this. But then during my internship, I got to see a different side of computational linguistics, because the lab was working on creativity, on language creativity. And this was the first time we really talked about the construction of meaning. And then over those years, it kind of dawned at me that everything I want to study can always be broken down to kind of the study of meaning. And the primary tool for me to start understanding this is sort of like language. And it also allows me to look at it from all the other disciplines. I can look at psycholinguistics, I can look at neurolinguistics, I can look at computational linguistics, cognitive linguistics. So I wasn't losing anything, but I was gaining a focus on something that I think was very fundamental to understanding.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Actually, it already bridges quite nicely to our the first topic we wanted to dive in, because we thought, well, what is creativity even? Because it's quite hard to grasp that concept. And can you maybe give us a short explanation on what creativity is? Like, what is it? We talk about it, but what is it?
Yeah. So I teach a seminar in computation creativity, and my first lecture always starts where I ask the students, what is creativity? And then I let them talk for half an hour, and they come up with all these nice bullet points and theories, and then I tell them all of this is true and all of this is false, right? I think it's this thing that you can find in many other subdomains like artificial intelligence. Everyone is doing AI, and then you ask them for a sound definition of intelligence, and then people struggle. It's the same. I think it's very similar with creativity, and it's the same or similar with consciousness. You ask people what is consciousness, and then they come up with criteria and bullet points and experiments and stuff like this. And you will always find an edge case where that may not be the case. So for creativity, obviously in this field of computational creativity, we need some form of metric. And creativity, in that sense, where most researchers agree upon, is the answer to a question. So let's say there's a problem and there is a question, and you answer this question, and then you can think about, does the answer have any novelty or value? These are the two kind of like trademarks that people often associate with creativity. So the answer is super novel and has value, either for the person themselves or for the society as a whole. But it could also be whether the question may be raising another, or the answer is raising a question that has not been asked before. An example of this would be, for instance, John Cage's 433. If you're familiar with this,
No, could you explain?
Piece. So the composer John Cage has this piece. It's 4 minutes 33, and it's complete silence. So the entire note sheet is a silence for 4 minutes 33. And you have orchestras performing this piece in front of a large audience. And it's kind of changing the perspective on what a pause or what even the audience can be. Because if you listen to an audience of an entire orchestra for 4 minutes 33, you'll hear the coughing, you'll hear the moving, you'll hear every little movement of jackets and so forth. So it's kind of like a little experiment, and it's providing a new perspective or new questions to something that hasn't been previously investigated. So that's a creative solution. Right? And then you have something where people define creativity as a result of intense motivation. This one is a bit tricky. So I always provide this example of the movie by Wiseau, the one with the spoons. You probably know it's considered like the worst movie ever made. Now I have dropped the name. The Room.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that. No, I'm not.
And then you're lucky, right? It's Wiseau had this idea that he wants to become a director, but he had no credentials and nobody would give him funding. So he started building his own movie, crowdsourcing the material, and it turns out to be an extremely bad movie from start to end. The script, the actors, everything. But it reached cult status, and many people know this movie. I can Sönke nodding, so maybe not the movie. And even Hollywood picked it up and made a movie about making this movie, right? And this is sort of one of these examples where there's just intense motivation behind something that people would consider creative, even though it may not have the same value as other things. So you can frame questions like this, and then you can find if the answers raise new questions, change perspectives, turn something that has been previously established into something that questions the very thing. So an example here would be Duchamp's urinal. Marcel Duchamp at one point decided he can just put a urinal into a museum and then it becomes art. And people didn't really understand because he was the first to do this kind of provocative art. And he basically created a whole new concept of art and what does it mean to be presented in a museum or at an exhibition. So these are these four kind of questions that creativity can answer. And in the field of computation and creativity, what most creativity researchers are looking at is basically just novelty and value. These are the two most important things. If you want, I can also elaborate on the terms novelty and value.
I mean, because like the next question would be all of those examples were like examples of human creativity, and we are like famously known for creativity. And then the question would become like, if I try to make an algorithm that is creative, like how do I measure it, and is that even possible, and where does the novelty or whatever come from?
That's basically a question that the Society of Computation Creativity has tried to answer for the last 40 years.
And now you can answer it right now and the perfect answer to it.
Now I can give you the one and all answer. It's not 42. But
that's a shame.
It's a pity. But actually, there are many different frameworks that have been developed to look at this. So there can be a long answer where I go over all of these different frameworks, but a shorter answer may just be, so in the beginning, people often did a Turing test for creativity. So they were saying, okay, I'm going to write a poetry generator, and if humans can no longer distinguish the output, whether it is from a machine or whether it is from a human, then we have achieved something that is creative to some extent. If you do that now at one of these conferences, people will not like it anymore, right? For the very simple reason, as you pointed out, we would be judging machines with a metric that we use for human creativity, and maybe machine creativity is something different. Maybe it's something we humans can't even understand to a certain extent. So how are we going to end up measuring it, right? So the argument from most researchers in this field would be to say we have to look at creativity as a process, and we can look at individual parts of this process. So maybe the creativity in the design phase of the program, maybe the creativity within the code itself, or maybe the creativity in the result, the artifact that results is to be judged. And then there's models that look at all these different steps and try to figure out, okay, how much creativity is there actually? There's a very nice barometer of creativity where you could say, you could look at something that is mere generation and something that is truly creative on the other end of the spectrum. And I think this is a nice way of looking at it. So mere generation would be something that only focuses on novelty or only focuses on value without the other one. So an example would be for something that is purely novel but has zero value. You could imagine a pixel generator that just simply flips pixels on the screen. It would be always completely novel, right? There's almost endless possibilities, but it would have zero value as you would just create new pixel grids. So that would be a merely generative system. Or you could look at something that only focuses on novelty, but only focuses on value, but not on novelty. So I could have a system that prints one of the most famous poems ever written every day. Then it would be very valuable because these poems have an inherent value, but it would have no novelty. And these would be merely generative systems.
I was just wondering, when you started explaining at the different levels you could look at when you try to estimate or kind of evaluate rather than estimate, evaluate how creative an algorithm is, that when you look at the code, my thought was, well, but then you're evaluating the human creativity again.
Yeah, that's true. That's always a factor in this. So on the spectrum of mere generation to true creativity, there are these different steps in which different factors will play a role, and you will always look at it within its context. So you would not judge a merely creative system, a merely generative system, with respect to creativity, because it's just merely creative, merely generative. But let's say there is, which is termed an inception in a creative system. So that would be, I have an idea for a system, and my idea would be creative, but I'm going to bury this idea so deep down in the code that on the artifact stage, there will be a completely different output. The system will work with whatever I'm going to give it and generalize or abstract from it in a way that my underlying idea is not present in the output anymore. So I'm incepting kind of my idea, the programmer's creativity, in the deep latent space of the system, so to say. And then you would judge it, of course, differently. Then you would judge maybe the idea of the programmer, and then you would judge the output of the system itself.
Okay, yeah.
And further steps would then be enriching the system to make it even more autonomous. So there would be no input from the programmer, but mostly input from, let's say, the environment.
I mean, in like the lectures we had, I heard like about these systems that were used to generate language, for example. So one famous, rather old system is like called ELIZA. So it was basically pre-written answers, and it was just checking for keywords, and then if the input had a certain keyword, it would just prompt one of the pre-written answers. And today, like, everybody has heard of ChatGPT, that is not pre-written by anyone, but also generates like answers. Do you think that there is like a difference in the level of creativity behind these systems, or is that nothing that we can even like put on a scale somehow?
That's a good question. The two systems are fundamentally different in one respect, right? That is a generative pre-trained transformer like ChatGPT is sort of a next word prediction system. And ELIZA is sort of a next response prediction in a way. And it doesn't even predict, right? It just simply follows a given path. So the other thing here is maybe I bring in a bit more terminology. So Margaret Boden, which is a big name in this field, came up with these two terms for something called P creativity and H creativity, personal creativity and historical creativity, respectively. And personal creativity, let's say, is the kind of like doodles we do on our paper when we're bored and maybe something nice comes out of it, right? Or better example, if I tell you, could you draw the Mona Lisa for me? And you start like drawing the Mona Lisa, and it's, depending on your capabilities, may or may not look interesting, right? But it would be a personal feat of creativity in this moment. Whereas the actual drawing of the Mona Lisa that once happened has an historical context. And I think you can also look at the difference between the creative merit of a system like ELIZA and ChatGPT from this perspective, right? So the first time ELIZA as a system was presented, there is a certain amount of creativity attributed to that. Would I say this now, knowing what other systems are capable of? Less so, right? But the fundamental difference here, for me to think about these systems, is an aspect that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is co-creativity. Because neither ChatGPT nor ELIZA are autonomously creative. They are not creating anything by themselves. They rely on the input from the human. And the artifact isn't just the text that is coming out of this. The artifact, in case of Eliza, is kind of like the personal, psychological revelation maybe that you have, and same with ChatGPT.
Could you maybe just briefly say what co-creativity is?
So I hope people from the field are not listening to this, because there's many papers where they give like a very rigid definition, and it's always important to do that. And I'm not the one who gave these definitions, so take this with a grain of salt. But co-creativity describes an act in which at least two agents are working on a task, and they are trying to solve this task cooperatively. And in that sense, that the output is often something, I mean, if you have a bad co-creative system, that isn't the case, but any good co-creative system, the output is determined by capabilities that neither of them by themselves could have done. So there has to be a synergistic effect. So I could not do that without the system, but the system could not do that without me. And that would be a co-creative system. And then there's different flavors of this, where you could say using paint, all right, as a tool is already a co-creative system, because it allows me to do things I couldn't do by myself. But this is simply the co-creative system as a tool, right? And then there is a co-creative system as a colleague, where it starts to criticize you or maybe bring in their own ideas. And then there's a co-creative system, sort of like a hand-holding system that just corrects you and steers you towards a better direction. More advanced drawing programs tend to do that. So there's different flavors of co-creative systems.
And then, for example, in ChatGPT, when you want to get an output, you always have to give some input. And when you just go and be like, tell me a story about a beaver, it will just be a very, very, very stereotypic story. And
yes,
when you've done that a couple of times, you always get the same story, but with different, well, not people, but with different subjects acting in the story. That kind of leads me to another point of, how does an algorithm even know how to make up a story? Because, as I've mentioned, maybe some people have played around with ChatGPT and went like, tell me a story about a dog and a cat who have a friendship and go to the forest. I don't know, but that's something you could use ChatGPT for. And then you get a story which may or may not be good. You can also argue whether it's creative or not. But how does the algorithm even know how to make up the story?
I could toss back the question, how do you make up a story, right? Because that would be the ultimate model that we want to do. Right? So there's always this, wouldn't say struggle, maybe that's a personal academical issue, right? That there's this one group of research or this one strain of research that tries to optimize. So how can we build a system that builds creative stories? And then we have a strain of research that tries to understand, how do humans create stories? So we build a model that can model how humans create stories. There's often a big overlap, obviously, in these systems. But specifically in the field of computational linguistics these days, the shift is really on the optimization part. So how can we create even bigger, even more capable models? And we're sacrificing a lot of explainability with this, right? So we don't really know how ChatGPT works in that sense. Obviously, you can probe and prompt it to understand inner workings. But if you say, so you're coming back to your question, if you say, how does an algorithm plan these kind of things? That just really depends on the algorithm, in the sense that before language modeling, most of the systems for storytelling were strongly inspired by how humans are building these stories. So they were using a lot of the theory that comes from creative writing in order to build systems that are capable of doing this. And while in theory these systems were applying these principles and gave you decent stories, I'd say not very convincing, but decent stories, Then you look at something like ChatGPT that does not look at this theory whatsoever and is able to create much more enriched and much more colorful and interesting stories. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
I'm also not quite sure, to be honest. It answered something, but I'm not sure if it was the question I had.
Yeah. So there are algorithms that use a lot of this theory of how humans plan to develop a story. One of the primary examples is, I wouldn't call it archetype theory, but there are certain story archetypes. And there are certain ways in which stories are being told. There's classical narrative theory, narratology, and those fields already provide blueprints and rules of how to compose stories. So, for example, my first project in computational linguistics was to build a storytelling system. And this was way before language modeling. So it was surely to be a symbolic approach in which I was given a book. And the book was called Plotto. And this book told you how to write stories. And it was basically an algorithm printed out on 200 pages in which you could see, okay, what my starting point is a single character or multiple characters. And from there, you need to find a drama. So go on page 112 for the list of dramas. And then you find a conflict. And then you go to page 212 and you find another conflict between two other characters. And if you follow all of these pages, it's like these little build your own adventure books. You would end up with a story, or at least a story skeleton, and then you would augment the story skeleton with names, proper names, and context, and then you would have a story. And this book was actually used by writers to write stories. If you look at how many books are being published by certain writers, they release books every 2 or 3 months, and they need these kind of techniques to permutate over different story types. And the first instance of working with this was to take this book and turn it into an actual algorithm that can pump out these story skeletons that they can be enriched using databases with proper environments and names and things like this.
In a scenario like that, we are forced to create something that looks the same, but as you the example you had earlier about that composition that was just silence, something like that can never be created by such an algorithm, or maybe the algorithm has an early exit and says the story just ends. Is that a limit to this approach, and is there generally a limit to approaches like that, or they favor a certain type of story that maybe has been done before?
Okay, there was many questions in kind of one, but the first thing that comes to my mind here, and you're absolutely right. So what Cage did there was a transformation, right? And this leads back to Boden, that I mentioned earlier, and she defines 3 types of creativity. I like how researchers always need these kind of rigid categories. So she says there's combinatorial, exploratory, and transformational creativity. And she basically argues that creativity is sort of a walk in a space. Think of a garden or whatsoever. And you want to find a certain goal. And the way you're looking at for it is defining how you are doing the creative act. Right? So combinatorial creativity is best example is the cut-up technique, if you're familiar with this. So David Bowie used this for writing his songs. So just you take newspapers, you cut up the newspapers, and you put together random articles, and then you get a lyrics for your new song. So you combine things that already exist to create something novel. That is sort of the combinatorial creative act. And you could say that basically that's what ChatGPT is doing. It has seen millions of tokens, and instead of just predicting the most likely next token, which would always lead to the exact same story, the most told average story, it just combines by randomizing the tokens, and then leads to different pathways and so forth. So I guess in that sense, it's limited to this combinatorial, but also exploratory notion. Exploratory would then be not looking at things that already exist, but maybe going above and beyond the things that already exist. But always relating them to things that we would be familiar with in that sense. So instead of staying in the garden and picking different flowers, you leave the garden and find new flowers, so to say. And transformational creativity now would be you're no longer in a garden, right? In the sense that a good example here would be Schopenhauer's 12-key music, if you're familiar with this. So basically challenging the very essence of what harmonic music is supposed to be and coming up with a completely different idea of what that can be. But that really means leaving every notion or convention that previously existed and finding a completely new space to develop an idea. And I think that is the hardest and most challenging form of creativity. Right? And then you can look at something, so that's why the study of improvisation or jazz music are very interesting for creativity researchers, because it basically is per definition not bound to conventions in that sense. I mean, there are still conventions in that, but those are structures maybe necessary to have at least some form of music or whatever.
You just mentioned like jazz music, and that's something that's usually like created by multiple people at the same time. And I think like a lot of types of storytelling or like performance storytelling requires like some feedback. Is there a way that this can be like integrated into the story at real time, so like the system reacts to something that reacts to it, and I mean I think that would be like something different to what we discussed earlier with ChatGPT, because like I bring like the topic and ChatGPT gives like a predicted answer, and in this case maybe this system introduces like its own new thing and then reacts to me reacting to it.
Yeah, that's a very big part. So in this spectrum from mere generation to true creativity, at least to some researchers, the key component for true creativity or later stages of true creativity is input, and specifically input based on environmental observations. So something that is really non-linear, really not simple feedback from one human, right? So it could be a variety of sensory modalities or something like this. I would not go as far as to say that ChatGPT could never achieve this, right? So we don't really know what it works with, but I could imagine a scenario in which ChatGPT tracks your response time, and if you're being more patient or less patient, and creates a character profile, and whether you like an answer or not. So it kind of like could create some form of fake personality, and then it would work differently with you instead of another person. Right? So I can see that ChatGPT can also create this kind of feedback-based context that is not purely relying on textual input, or you're only the textual input. But yeah, it's very limiting to have like only text in and output. So the systems that really do that, and to come to your point of like jazz improv, there is a system actually, a robot that does jazz improvisation, and it uses nonverbal feedback. So it would start cueing in other players by nodding. I mean, nodding is a bit anthropomorphizing. So its head would wobble up and down to indicate the rhythm, and then other jazz musicians would know to take this as a cue to start cueing in. And they've actually performed this and tried this, and the feedback from jazz musicians was overwhelmingly positive. That they say, okay, there is a sense of understanding and cueing. So yeah, that's certainly a thing, and this, I mean, leads to what I'm also very interested in, right? So I look at its forms of embodiment forms of incorporating the body in these kind of creative interactions.
Is there already a project or some research where kind of a robot or some embodied AI is reading or analyzing how an interaction partner reacts upon whatever is produced by the robot? So, for example, I was just thinking about assistant robots in, I don't know, maybe airports, where I think it's in Japan, if I'm not much mistaken, where they already have these robots that assist people to find their way, etc. But as far as I know, they don't really read how the people react. And I was wondering, are there already approaches to read facial expression, body language, and to also let that have an influence on how the robot or system interacts with the human?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's already happening and that is already implemented. The big problem there is mostly privacy concerns, that people don't want to have their face read by a system. I mean, you mentioned Japan. Japan is much more progressive when it comes to this kind of research because of cultural reasons. People are just so much more used to being exposed to robots that they already have these kind of. They use them, I think, in museums as well to guide people. And the research is much further than the actual what is out there situations allow for. Um, but good, really, really good examples, I think, are in elderly care. So I also work with projects in the elderly care and assistive robots. There, for example, you want a robot to recognize that a patient may have a stroke, right? So you have to read non-verbal cues from that person. So the robot needs to call help and change the interaction accordingly. Or if a person appears to stumble or fall, you need to register all of this. And these systems already exist. They're not, I mean, they're expensive and they're still in research stages. And you can imagine that there's a lot of privacy concerns and trust concerns with having a robot or a camera surveilling you 24/7. But these systems exist and they're in place in research stages mostly. And I think it's a very valuable contribution to have more input, more data to also check for nonverbal cues, because a lot of the communication happens in nonverbal areas.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even fully understood how humans read it. So I was just wondering, how does programming work when we don't even know how humans exactly analyze what's happening in their interaction partner?
Yeah. Um, there was always this argument that we don't understand language fully enough to model it so that it could have like long-term conversations. Turns out we don't need to understand it, apparently, right? We just need a lot of data and a lot of compute. And we can see now how these systems are being used in the same way. So autonomously driving cars are also, I think, a good example. We don't need to understand. You wouldn't even succeed in programming every explicit rule of how to drive a car, and then the car would drive, because that never happens in real life. Because humans are so error prone that you can't just rely on the rules. And I think it's very similar for these kind of systems. We don't understand we understand a fair deal of nonverbal behavior, but probably not all of it to have like a successful model. But I don't think that's what we need. Systems will now be in place that use huge amounts of data, annotated data, where people just spend many, many hours looking at YouTube videos and annotating movements of people and indicating things like this. And this will lead to systems that are capable of reading nonverbal behavior, even maybe some that is opaque to us, or to some people who can't read nonverbal behavior.
You mentioned earlier, like that you're interested in embodiment, and we now talked about like this rule-based systems. And I'm thinking, for humans, I feel like, or I think it's like considered that embodiment is like a two-way street of some sort. So like I'm having like a cognitive function, and that has effects on my body, and my body then kind of takes care of the cognitive function itself. So is the same thing like possible in artificial storytelling and embodiment, or is that maybe like one central system that gives out like just orders and they are executed by a robot?
So at this point, I would like to explain what is meant by embodiment, maybe, because people who are not in the field may not understand or may just take it as something that has a body. It is this, but it's also much more, right? And also, depending on the discipline you look at it, you can have a very different understanding of what embodiment actually means. In robotics, for example, as soon as it's a robot, it's embodied. So that's always often a problem in communication. If you talk to like a philosopher, it's a completely different notion sometimes. So embodiment in that sense, or at least how I will refer to it, comes from the theory of embodied cognition. And the theory of embodied cognition, which is actually not accepted by everyone, right, in cognitive science, I think by the large majority of people researching in this. But as soon as you go into other disciplines, you may or may not realize that this isn't an accepted or completely understood theory. So embodied cognition assumes that cognition itself is not just only a product of symbol manipulation in your brain. It is also extending to your body, because your brain is part of your body, and so may be cognition part of your body. And then there's different flavors of extended cognition, where you would say, right, if I count using my fingers, I'm extending my cognition to my body, or I write things down on a piece of paper in maths. I'm sort of like extending my thinking on a paper. Then you have embedded cognition and situated cognition and enacted cognition, right? So you have different flavors that look at the same thing. Often they just have different terminology to describe this overall phenomenon that we should also consider a body, or kind of sensory information that enters our brain through bodily modalities. Yeah. Could you repeat your question?
Like, is there like the similarity between the human embodiment and robot embodiment, or are those separate things? Because I thought like maybe for robots we have one central system and it does like the body movement of the robot and the storytelling, whatever, or the creative process, whatever that is, and it comes like from the same thing and just goes in two directions, as opposed to humans, where I would assume, like as you said, like counting with your fingers, where the body actually has a function and sends something back to the central processing system.
That's a very interesting point. I think that could be even a discussion point, right? Because I'm not 100% sure I see the difference that you are trying to describe. Are you saying that I can have a robotic system, let's say a robot that does the physical stuff, and on my laptop next to it, I run the creative process, and I'm just using the body as a proxy, and it has nothing to do with the actual creative process? Or
Yeah, that was like my question, if that is how embodiment in robots is usually like approached, or if it's something different.
yeah, I mean, no. So in the sense that, for example, you have this also in embodied cognition, right? This theory of active inference and predictive processing, right? I'm not going to explain these terms now. Uh, in a nutshell, if I'm trying to understand my environment, I can do that more efficiently if I'm able to interact with my environment. So if I want to understand whether the cup is a cup or something else, what most people end up doing is they turn their head around the object, they take the object, they turn the object, we smell. I mean, for cups, it makes no sense. But you can see you use all of your modalities to kind of sample more data in order to build a more robust model of your world. And robots do the same. So if you have a robot that needs to solve a task, it doesn't explicitly starts turning around the head, but through its movement, it will inevitably sample more data. And through this kind of interaction with the environment, it's able to figure out whether the thing that it's doing is more successful or less successful. So it's actually, I think a robot is actually a nice metaphor for what active inference can be, right? So it extends the model that you're running on wherever through the physical world, and it's sampling more data from different modalities and perspectives. You will have a hard time finding a robotics paper that would describe it like this and relate it to embodied cognition. But that's kind of what you can frame it as well, right? So in a way, yes, you will not find many papers that describe it as I would do it now, and that would answer your question. But in essence, I think that's what they do.
Considering that we already spent quite some time, one very important thing that we wanted to ask is because there was like this strike from the Writers Guild in America about like these artificial storytelling systems being used or like having to introduce rules for that. Do you have like a perspective on that you want to share? Like how is this impacting the future, and is there really a threat in there, or is it just a chance to enhance like human creativity?
Yeah, I think we're just at the very start of a transformation process. And what people were, I would say, afraid of, in quotes, yeah, back then, what was it, last year, 2 years ago, something like this, with the strike of the Writers Guild. I think by now we should be, quote unquote, afraid of even other things. Right? So I think what they have been scared of, and it wasn't. I mean, you're right. It's about writing or writing processes. They actually did not really see a threat to writers in the sense that they can use it as a supportive tool, and I think they do. And maybe that is a stronger opinion, and I may have a controversial opinion on this, but I believe that with the introduction of generative writing systems, there are a certain amount of jobs that are going to be replaced, which I personally think can be replaced in the sense that I don't have any big moral objections that writing the 100th BuzzFeed article on what personality type you are can be done by a machine. It doesn't need human resources. And I'm pretty sure even some writers agree with me that they say some of the writing work we do is just extremely dull and can be replaced by a machine. And all of the other writing, the creative writing of novels, of scripts, of good television, of good comedy, those are not in danger of being replaced in the near future. We have another different perspective of the writer strikes. Just to highlight that was also like general working conditions, right? And then also one on the replacement of extras in movies through 3D models, because there's a whole industry of people who are not the main actor or actress in a movie, but you have a lot of people that also do the other stuff around, and this other stuff around is much easier to be replaced by simulated environments. And with text to video models that we see right now coming out, we have an even bigger threat to these kind of jobs. And there I'm actually a bit more critical and say, okay, they should be implemented in a way that is more sensitive towards different societal needs as well.
I feel like there's often this line of argument that creative jobs, well, we already heard in the beginning that defining creativity is tough, but that really creative jobs are not that much endangered, but those jobs that follow a basic script, for example, writing BuzzFeed articles, can be replaced by algorithms. But even there's some limitations we will have, because I'm just thinking, when we have the 100 personality text on BuzzFeed, of course we don't need a human for that, but do we even need that text?
Exactly. And I think that's a very good point. Can I just
Yeah, sure.
go into
Take
that?
over.
So if you look at the text to video systems, something like Zora by OpenAI, right? I will just predict now, and this is speculative, but I don't think many people will disagree. Content on social media will become inflated in the next 5 years. It already is, right? I mean, there's already so much e-waste out there that you would not even look at. It's just content for the sake of content. And people are being flooded with these kind of information, texts, articles, videos, pictures. And then there's this thing called the dead internet theory. Are you familiar with this?
Can you shortly explain it?
Yeah, so just very briefly, it says that at some point the internet will consist mostly of bots chatting to one another or creating content that is being passed around by bots, right? And then every kind of conversation is just bots talking to one another, and we are creating a huge pile of completely irrelevant content for everyone. And I think this is an opportunity. If you want to speak to the optimist, yeah, I think that's an opportunity in that sense. It forces us to have a transformational change in creative understanding. We can no longer have the 100th Marvel movie. We have to come up with something else. People are tired of the BuzzFeed articles, so we have to create something new, something novel. If you ask the pessimist, we're drifting towards very reactionary content. Yeah, content that has to be extreme, content that has to provoke, and that is often divisive. And I will leave it there, right? So you can also see a problem with this kind of oversaturation of content. Yeah.
I think that were like very important words. But considering like the whole interview, do you have something where you think like if someone has listened to this episode, they should definitely take that away from it?
Yes, I think language. I said in the beginning, right? I looked at language and I first thought of it as a tool, and I'm not really sure that many people understand this, but even in my field, it is always assumed that language is sort of like the basis for our thinking because most people think in language. And we built a model of language with something like ChatGPT, and all of a sudden we realize it's now capable of these emergent properties like some form of creativity, some form of reasoning. And there's a good argument to say, yeah, this is because language is not just a tool to express. It's actually enables us to be intelligent, to have common sense, to reason, and to do all of these things. And we are now using a system built solely around language to solve problems that have almost nothing to do with language, robotics, computer vision, and all of these kinds of things, only based on the patterns that are inherent in language. And the study of this, I think, is extremely important, whether you study psychology, neuroscience, even I mean, maybe neurobiology is a bit further away from all of this. But I think that there's some fundamental structures within language that can help us understand many things. It could be creativity, it could be societal problems, it could be other issues as well. So maybe the takeaway is anyone who's like generally interested in this, don't underestimate linguistics, right, and the role of language in cognition and consciousness.
I think this also already closes it to the context of cognitive science, because you've already mentioned language is cognition, and language always has to do with the thinking process. And well, you can't talk about cognition without thinking or talking about language to a certain degree. So if there's nothing more you would like to add, I would thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us and being here today and explaining creativity, computational creativity, and diving into all those different aspects.
Thank you very much. I tried my best. And it was very, very nice, very engaging questions. And yeah, I could have talked for another hour if you wanted to. But yeah, thanks again.
Thanks. When you enjoy listening to us, the best way to support us is by following us on your chosen podcast app. This could either be Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or the website of the Cognitive Science Student Journal. Another good way to support us is by following our Instagram account, which is called kaleidoscience_pod. On our Instagram account, you will also get regular information on the next episode. Thanks a lot for supporting us. This was Kaleidoscience, hosted by Elisa Palmer and Sönke Löw. Produced by Alina Ohnesorge, Elisa Palmer, Sönke Löw and Sophie Kühne. Produced in collaboration with the Cognitive Science Student Journal. The music was produced by Jan-Luca Schröder. The logo was designed by Annika Richter. Thank you for listening and joining us on our journey through conversations on cognitive science.